So I've got about 1,000 hours of piston time and about 75 hours of turboprop time so far. And I've noticed that lately, as I've been sharing with people how I got checked out in the Kodiak 100, which is a turboprop bush aircraft, I kind of keep saying the same thing to people. I say, you know, there's definitely a learning curve, but once you learn the new gauges and levers and buttons and stuff, flying it is actually a lot simpler than my 182. So I wanted to unpack that thought here in case it might be insightful to anyone else. And if we're meeting for the first time, my name is Charlie Gassmeyer. I'm a commercially licensed pilot here in Dallas, Texas, and I own a Cessna 182, and I make helpful content for private pilots. So here are some ways that I've noticed the Kodiak 100 can be easier in a lot of ways than my Cessna 182. And I'll kind of go in chronological order through the flight so that it just kind of, that's how my brain works. So we'll start from the beginning and I'll kind of walk you through some of the differences. For anyone that's ever started a piston aircraft before, you know that it can be a little temperamental, right? You're trying to find that perfect mixture between fuel and air, and it just kind of depends on the day, right? If it's really hot and you have a fuel injected airplane, sometimes it can be harder to start. Sometimes when it's really cold in a carbureted aircraft, it can be hard to start. You're like, okay, I primed it this many times. Did I give it too much fuel? Did I not give it enough? Did I flood the thing? I need to like start over. And I think we all probably have one of those memories, particularly as a student pilot. I have plenty of these where you're sitting on the ramp and you just can't get the thing started. And you're like, oh my gosh, am I gonna have to go get an instructor to ask like, how do you start the airplane, guys? Like, surely we could do that, but you know, it can be temperamental. But in the Kodiak, starting the PT6 is really, really simple. There's no piston turnover moment where you get that fuel to air mixture just right and all of a sudden, you know, kind of roars to life. But instead, that PT6 slowly starts coming to life, and it's really simple. You basically turn on the igniters, which is kind of like starting a gas grill or a gas stove or something, and you can hear it clicking. It's going click, 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 click. And then you engage the starter, which starts spooling up the engine. And I'm being kind of overly simplistic here, but follow me. Spooling up the engine, kind of like turning on a fan, where it starts slow and starts picking up speed. And then once the engine has enough cooling air going through it and the igniters are already going, you introduce fuel into the whole equation and it ignites. And then the combustion starts turning the engine faster and faster. And then eventually you can disengage the starter because the combustion is turning the engine on its own, and now it's started. So here's a clip of the startup sequence without my commentary, just to show what it's like.
Okay, ready if you are. Okay, ready. Okay.
Now, I'm obviously simplifying things just a bit because there's more items on the checklist than what I just described, but you get the idea. It's not as temperamental as a piston. And so this is probably a good time to recognize that, yeah, obviously there's a lot more turboprops in the world than just the Kodiak 100. There's a lot more engines than just the individual PT6 that's in this aircraft. And are some of those way more complicated than this? Yeah, absolutely. And so are there turboprops that have really advanced fuel systems and complicated pressurization systems? All that, yeah, of course. And so I'm not saying across the board that turboprops are always easier or simpler than piston aircraft, but in my particular experience, so I'll just save you keyboard warriors the keystrokes here, I have found it to be really relaxing when you're flying the Kodiak 100. There's not as much, as you're about to hear me describe, there's not as much to do in flight as even my simple Cessna 182. The other thing that kind of keeps it simpler and why other turboprops are probably more complicated than the Kodiak is the Kodiak's only going 170 knots, so it's kind of piston speed. Whereas if you're going like 300 plus knots in a TBM or something, the speed at which things are happening, that alone can make it way more complicated and probably stressful than flying my 182. So again, I'm just comparing the Kodiak 100 to my 182, and I am surprised that I thought it was gonna be this big leap into, oh my gosh, it's so much more complicated to fly. But once you get through that learning curve, it's like, oh, this is actually pretty simple. So that's what I'm trying to communicate here. And so the next thing that is simpler than my 182 is the run-up. So there are 26 items on the before takeoff checklist in the Kodiak 100 and only 10 in my 1975 Cessna 182. However, most of the 26 are really fast and you can do pretty much all of them while you're still on the FBO ramp instead of needing a specific run-up. Now there's one exception with an overspeed governor, which does require you to run up the engine, but that's really only called for on the first flight of the day. So sometimes you're not even doing it at all. So what feels simpler about the Kodiak pre-takeoff checklist is that you can do all of it pretty much while you're sitting there on the ramp. So you start up the engine, you go through those checks, and then you go through the before takeoff checklist, and you're pretty much set up to go. And then while you're taxiing to the runway, ATC is going to assume that you are ready at the end. Chapter 4 of the AIM says that the tower controller will consider that pilots of turbine-powered aircraft are ready for takeoff when they reach the runway or warm-up block unless advised otherwise. So to me, this ends up just feeling a lot simpler and more straightforward in the Kodiak, because you start up, you do your checks, and by the time you get to the end, you're ready to go. Whereas in the Piston, yeah, you start up and kind of go through those checks, then you taxi down to the run-up area, and you got to check the mags and the prop and the carb heat, all of which are pretty simple, right? But it's just kind of a choppy flow to getting ready to go. Whereas in the Kodiak, you start up, you go through your checks, and by the time you reach the end, ATC is already expecting that you're ready, and so off you go. And so I think it's a little simpler in that way. Next is the climb out. Propeller management in the Kodiak is a lot simpler than my 182. So in a Piston, if you're flying around at 23 squared or something, meaning you have 23 inches of manifold pressure and 2,300 RPMs, and then you want to climb, and say maybe it's at 24 inches and 2,450 RPMs, you'd move that prop first, controlling the RPMs to go up to the 2,450, followed by the throttle lever, which controls manifold pressure. Now, when you reach steady flight and you want to go back down to 23 squared, you reverse the process and you decrease the manifold pressure first through the throttle lever down to 23 inches, and then the RPMs controlled by the prop lever down to 2,300 RPMs. Now, once you've flown a constant speed prop for a while, this becomes second nature and it's a little more intuitive and it makes sense. But I can say from experience, when you're first learning, you're always worried about getting it backwards because you're like, well, I have a 50-50 shot of doing this correctly. So which one do I increase or decrease first? Because it's opposite depending on, if you're increasing it or decreasing it or whatnot. So I don't want to get it wrong, and it can be intimidating at first. But in the Kodiak, during the climb, you reduce the prop to 2,000 RPMs and you basically just leave it there the rest of the flight until right before landing, when you go full forward on the prop. You're not messing with the prop during the climb out, and it's really simple in that way. And similarly, there's no fuel leaning in the Kodiak. So in my 182, you're ultimately moving all three of those levers at various times. The throttle, the prop, the mixture, all three of them are going to move. Particularly if you're flying on a controlled airspace like me, where they might clear you to 2,000 feet going out of Addison, and so you're going to have different climb settings, and then you level off in your cruise settings, and then they clear you to an intermediate altitude. Okay, now go to 3,000, now 4,000, and then eventually 8,000. And all along the way, you're kind of changing the throttle and prop settings, and then kind of leaning the airplane while you're at cruise, and then give it a little more mixture when you're climbing, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to be moving all of those levers a lot in that circumstance. In the Kodiak, it's far simpler. There's no mixture leaning, and so you're not touching that fuel condition lever at all in flight. So that simplifies the control inputs quite a bit, because you're mainly just using the power lever based on your desired performance and your fuel burn and whatnot. And then you just pay attention to make sure to not over temp or over torque the engine. And because you're mainly just working with the power lever, controlling engine temps is pretty straightforward. As you go higher, you'll probably reach temperature limitations of the engine before you reach torque limitations. And so watching your ITT or your inner turbine temperature becomes pretty simple. You're just adjusting the power to stay within limits. And if all of that sounds like new terminology to you, and it definitely was for me, don't worry, I will link another video at the end of this that explains all of that stuff in plain English. And I promise that once you just kind of understand it and understand the context, it's really, really not that hard. If you can do it, I'm gonna say if you can do it, I can do it. If I can do it, you can do it, and I mean that. So we were just talking about temperature management, and another thing that's a little simpler in the Kodiak, kind of in regards to temperature, is that you don't have carburetor heat to consider because there's no carburetor. Now, obviously using carburetor heat is not laborious, right? It's like you just pull it on, push it off or whatever, but that is something you're remembering on each flight, because you can get carb ice even in the middle of the summer in the right conditions, and I have gotten that before. So it's nice, it's just one less thing you have to think about. And then another thing the Kodiak doesn't have is cow flaps. You don't have any cow flaps to manage. And I say manage kind of sarcastically, because cow flaps don't really take much effort to manage, but they are another thing that you have to think about when managing the engine temperatures. And in my 182 in particular, I've got a 1975. In the winter during cruise flight, it always takes a few minutes to kind of dial in that perfect balance of leaning the mixture, using some carb heat if it's necessary and if it's cold enough, and then partially closing the cow flaps and also not overheat the engine. Mine can really overheat quickly, even in the winter, if you close the cow flaps all the way. Now, the newer 182s have much better cooling, and so you can close the cow flaps and not think too much about it in cruise, but in my plane, it'll overheat pretty quickly, and so cow flaps are a little bit more finicky. Real quick, if you found this helpful, I want to let you know that I just launched a free new resource called my Insiders newsletter, where once a week I'm sending out an email that contains an important aviation lesson that I've learned over the years and how you can apply it to your life, and also links to my latest content so that way you don't miss anything. And then I also share some behind the scenes content. I'm working on a really big new project that I can't announce yet, but I'm gonna start sharing some of the behind the scenes with insiders on that newsletter. So you can sign up over at airplaneacademy.com/insiders, and then I'll also include a link down in the description. It's really easy to sign up, so I'll see you there. I say this jokingly, but there is a lot of truth to it, that I feel like in the Kodiak, if you just give it fuel and start it, and then keep giving it fuel, it's going to run, and there's not a whole lot to do on top of that. It's pretty simple. But there is a learning curve to this airplane. There are some new systems to learn. There's new terminology, there's new levers and buttons and all that stuff. And so in the video on the screen, I put together a whole video talking about some of the big differences between turboprops and pistons that I've learned because I'm fresh off the boat, kind of getting into the turboprop world. And I wanted to put that video together in case it might help someone else. So that's on the screen right now, and I will see you there.